Lee Penrose, Jan O'Sullivan and Anna Sweet O'Smalley.
Agreed.
Las Concorda, this evening the Labour Party is calling for a 2-year moratorium on family home repossessions by all banks covered by the NAMA scheme, the provision of a service to assist mortgage holders in difficulty with coming to an arrangement with lenders, and to establish as a principle of public policy, where possible and subject to reasonable limits, the family making an honest effort to meet their obligations should be assisted in their efforts to remain in the family home. The dramatic downturn in the economic situation, particularly the massive increase in unemployment, has created huge difficulties for families in meeting mortgage arrears. As a result of the increase in numbers on the live register and the collapse of many small businesses, couples who bought their homes over the past decades and who have took on heavy mortgages in good faith, based on the incomes they were earning, suddenly find that the loss of one or both jobs leaves them unable to meet their monthly repayments. While the significant number of actual repossessions to date has been modest, there is a significant increase in the numbers of applications coming before the courts, as shown in today's newspapers. There is a real fear that once the position of the banks is solidified by the enactment of the NAMA legislation, a flood of repossession orders will be unleashed. The recently estimated figures that there could be as much as 35,000 mortgage holders in trouble is a social time bomb ticking that needs to be defused. Apart from the social consequences for families, repossessions will do little for the financial institutions. They may well be able to take repossession of a home, but in the current economic climate, they will have great difficulty in being able to sell it. Given the number of households facing negative equity, banks may face large losses in selling repossessed homes, whereas other actions, such as rescheduling of mortgages, for instance, would mean the bank would eventually get its money back. The Labour Party motion sets out this evening a number of actions the government should take to avoid this potential disaster. The most urgent is a statutorily based 24-month moratorium on repossessions, where reasonable efforts are being made to meet obligations. We also want a mediation service to assist borrowers in coming to satisfactory arrangements with lenders, such as extending the period of mortgage, putting a mortgage on an interest-only basis, or rolling up interest for a period, and to act on behalf of borrowers in negotiating with financial institutions and public authorities in working out viable repayment arrangements. Las Concorda, I put the following motion before the House this evening: that Dáil Éireann notes the rapid rise in the unemployment of the past 12 months and the resulting difficulties that many families are having in meeting mortgage repayments. Notes the number of families in mortgage arrears could be as high as 35,000. Notes that irresponsible lending practice engaged by many financial institutions had contributed to the growing problem of mortgage arrears. It notes the unprecedented assistance that has been provided to the banks through the blanket guarantee, recapitalisation and NAMA proposals. Notes with concern the number of repossession orders issued in the High Court increased by 120% in 2008, and the prospect of a significant increase in home possessions once the NAMA legislation has been passed and legal proceedings in these cases are transferred to the Circuit Court on the 1st of December 2009. Believes that, in the majority of cases, the public interest is best served by ensuring that families can remain in their homes for as long as possible, so long as reasonable efforts are made to meet the borrower's obligations. It calls on the government to bring forward a moratorium scheme that would provide for a minimum period of 24 months from the time that mortgages first go into arrears before repossession proceedings can be taken, where a borrower makes reasonable efforts to meet their obligations to pay the mortgage on a principal private residence. To apply the scheme to all banks covered by the guarantee or participating in NAMA, to establish the scheme on a statutory basis, to provide for mediation services under the scheme to assist borrowers in coming to a satisfactory arrangement with lenders, such as extending the period of a mortgage, putting a mortgage on an interest-only basis, or rolling up interest for a period, and to act on behalf of borrowers in negotiating with financial institutions and public authorities in working out viable repayment arrangements. To establish as a principle of public policy, where possible and subject to reasonable limits, a family making a reasonable and honest effort to meet their obligations should be assisted to remain in the family home. Las Concorda, if I could begin by putting this debate in its proper context. If one examines the census figures, one would see how unsustainable the Irish property market actually was. Between 2002 and 2006, a net 181,563 additional households were created. During the same period, an additional 260,718 housing units were actually built. Thereby, nearly 80,000 houses were built as holiday homes or as empty investment properties. It was clearly unsustainable to have 30% of new housing empty. However, and this is the great mystery of it all, however, house and land prices continued to rise during this period, suggesting that demand was even greater than the unsustainable supply. But it was a false demand, a demand buoyed up by a falling credit standards, light touch regulation, lower interest rates, along with encouraged speculation and tax incentives on property. During this period, what we actually witnessed was a game, a financial game, and a financial game set out by an unholy trinity, a union of Fianna Fáil-led government, banks and greedy developers. And why should the public actually believe this union has ended? Yes, the property bubble may have burst, but who said the relationship has died along with the game? This was a game where the passing of liability of this recklessness to homeowners was enacted, and this is how it was played. A developer would purchase an overvalued asset. The bank would provide the overvalued loan. The housing units are built and sold at an overinflated price to home buyers through overvalued loans provided by banks. The mortgages would then be sold on the international international market, and the banks again released this money to developers who would purchase further overvalued sites. The net consequence is that the liability of these loans and loose banking practice was passed down onto homeowners. And of course, as part of the game, with the end of every football season, the developer made his way to the Galway tent in September and paid over his contribution. Another aspect of this game was how lending rules went out the window. Take, for example, the typical home mortgage, where loan value and borrowing ratios and scheduled payments were allowed to increase without intervention. The idea of somebody buying a home at 4 to 5 times their annual income was stretched out to maybe 10 to 12 times their annual income. Mortgage schedules went from 20 years out to 35 years, and we saw the notion of 10% deposits going out the window with 100% mortgages being granted. Things actually got so out of hand during this period that affordable housing no longer became affordable. We were watching houses being bought for €250,000 under the affordable housing scheme. And today's prices on those affordable housing units show how far off the mark the property market had come during that period. As for duty of care, it certainly didn't exist. It didn't exist by government, and it didn't exist by lending institutions, and the only duty of care that was attended to here was getting re-elected back into office and delivering for the shareholders of the banks. The idea as well that homeowners would be financially stressed and that there may be difficulties coming down the line was certainly not a part of this creed for greed that was driven by this unholy trinity. It simply was, it doesn't matter if they can't make the loan in 3 or 4 months' time, the property value will increase in that period and the bank will make a tidy profit. And hence, if there was a foreclosure, sure, what harm, the bank would make money at the end of the day. So where are we now? It is estimated that the number of families in mortgage arrears, as I said, is 35,000, maybe more. On the 1st of September or December, we see the repossessions in legal terms moving from the High Court to the Circuit Court. And what is critical, and what this motion sets out this evening, is that it's imperative that action is taken now and new measures are put in place to slow down the rate of repossessions coming before the courts. The issue of people being able to keep a roof over their head is the real issue of systemic importance. So, what needs to be done? In developing policy in this area, it is important and that we move quickly, but that we also take into account the very complex technical and legal issues that arise and the wide range of individual circumstances that are experienced by borrowers. Policy has to take into account this diversity, and accordingly, I will set out a number of actions that need to be taken by government. The core value policy must be that whenever possible, the family should be assisted to continue residing in their home. This will offer the least costly approach to the state and the best outcome for the family concerned. It cannot, however, be seen as an absolute commitment. The greatest care has to be taken in circumscribing the rights of lenders and mortgage holders, since in the first place the relationship between the lending institution and the borrower is governed by contract, and those mortgage documents are in all cases prepared by the lending institutions. They are loaded against the borrowers and in favour of the lender. Thereby such mortgage agreements create very extensive rights and interests in favour of lenders at present. These rights are protected under the Constitution as property rights and also under the European Convention on Human Rights. However, I believe it is possible to unpick these extensive rights and, under emergency measures, even allow for a number of years to do so in the public interest and in circumstances of exceptional economic upheaval and uncertainty where we presently are. However, inbuilt into this process is that the borrower must make an honest and reasonable effort to meet and discharge their obligations in full. Such a scheme or provision cannot be applied to very large or expensive houses, obviously, and dominant intention must be clearly stated that the provision is made for families residing in what could be described as a typical family home. At present, the core plan of government policy is a code of conduct which is in place since February 2009, requiring a bank or building society not to commence repossessions until a mortgage is 6 months in arrears, or in the case of EIB, for 12 months. Labour's position is that this period should be extended to 24 months from the time the arrears first arise and should apply for all institutions. This ensures that the lending institution is strongly incentivised to actively engage with the borrower rather than entering into an empty formula and circulating a few pre-printed letters for the purposes of demonstrating technical compliance in case any issue arises with the financial regulator pertaining to the Consumer Protection Code. In practice, banks are reviewing the moratorium of 6 to 12 months as a hit that they have to suffer, but they are certain in the knowledge that they have the entitlement to interest on an ongoing basis and view the Code's provisions as entirely manageable from their perspective. The scheme we advocate, with this extensive extension of time, ensures strong incentivisation on parts of the banks to enter a restructuring and accommodation with the borrower. This process would take a number of different forms. For example, extending the lifetime mortgages, adjusting the number of repayments per annum, and accommodating for interest-only repayments for a period of time, or other arrangements to suit individual needs or expectations on the borrower. We have made suggestions for such changes at committee stages with regard to the NAML legislation, and will be doing so again this week at report stage. We have to recognise and have legislation to recognise the profound inequality of bargaining power between the borrower and the bank. This is not a level playing field. Stressed borrowers need professional assistance and support in negotiating with their lending institutions. In addition, it is vital that a code of conduct is strengthened up and adequately policed and enforced with a proper, effective, efficient grievance mechanism, and vitally that it is underpinned with legislation. Thank you very much. To achieve our objectives, a National Home Service mortgage should be established. A National Home Mortgage Service should be established with a legislative framework to operate as an advocate for home owners who face difficulties paying mortgages. The NHMS would, by means of a legislative framework, set out criteria and rules as to how mortgage difficulties would be addressed and managed, and would identify the obligations of government lending institutions and borrowers. To my way of thinking, this legislation would have to deal with and outlaw penalties, surcharges and constant endless adding on of fees, handling charges, and would probably have to expressly provide that all such charges, other than the basic rate of interest, should be deemed to constitute a penalty or be otherwise prohibited under the unfair terms in the Consumer Contracts Derivative. The function of the National Home Mortgage Service is envisaged to be complementary to, but quite separate and distinct from MABs and other voluntary groups. Such an amount of rigour would have to be attached to the operation of the process, and in fairness, under no circumstances is envisaged that the borrower who makes no effort whatever to meet their repayments will be granted security or occupation indefinitely on an open-ended basis. There will have to be a rebalancing of rights between the conflicting interests, and in all cases these would have to be repayments on an ongoing periodic basis by the borrower who remains in possession. There will be other eligibility factors also. That the mortgage variation would have to be fair to the borrower and the lender. An independent assessment of the borrower's true circumstances would have to be prepared and vouched. Assistance and relief could only be available to owner-occupiers, and an evaluation would have to be carried out to ascertain whether adverse changes in circumstances are irreversible or merely temporary for the expected duration, as a lot of the mortgages that have been issued in recent years create unsustainable positions. Ciaran Lynch, having carefully considered the matter, I am driven to the conclusion that a viable, robust mortgage modification programme can only be delivered by means of a statutory legislative code, and one that requires the need for a national home mortgage service. I commend this motion before the House.